But thinking about weird is interesting, and I didn't pay Simon, but I did look up weird myself, and he's absolutely right about this is about the power to control fate. And so this whole sense of your destiny, your weird is your destiny, is interesting. What I found in looking at this definition and some other words, other definitions of this weird of fate, chance, fortune, and destiny, the fates were often seen as being frightening. And they were portrayed often, that's what I like about the second paragraph, they were portrayed as odd or frightening in appearance, like they are in Macbeth, if you know the story of, and say, when shall we three meet again? You know, you can think of these old women, you know, kind of stirring the cauldron, looking very otherworldly. And that actually is the bottom line for weird. It's about otherworldly. And there's something in the human psyche that really likes to be comfortable and likes the known. And I've noticed, especially in this time when we're talking a lot about trauma, that people are trying to go back to what was the ordinary or the known to them, even if it was painful, because somehow they find comfort in the known. And that's our challenge when anything is weird or odd or strange, because we don't naturally turn towards it. So looking at weird, this was the definition that I received when I was talking to Sarah, and I thought I needed to have a deeper look at. This is from research from a group of guys called Joe Henrich, Steve Heine, and Ara Norensayan, and they talk about weird as this kind of parameter, Western. They didn't say white, but I'm wondering if that actually is one of the parameters too. We need to think about educated, industrialized, and I put here my take on I-focused, you know, that we have, at least in the US, and I think Australia is kind of like this too. It can be a very I-focused mentality rather than a collective mentality. Rich and democratic. So that's what weird stands for. Where this is interesting, this guy, Joe Henrich, took some research into Latin America. He tried the prisoner's dilemma game. That's where you give two people sorts of money, and they're trading for this money to see who's going to win in the end. And he said the indigenous people he played with were quite willing to play the money game because he was offering a substantial enough amount of money that they were interested, but they didn't play it at all like the documented research said. Now, the interesting thing to notice about documented research is usually, and a lot of this research has come out of the US, and it's usually research done on university age kids, and mostly male. So when we look at this old thing of fight, flight, or freeze, if you are aware of that kind of parameter, what do people do when they're under stress? These were the three that we mostly talked about, but actually a fourth one has come to light. Why? Because fight, flight, and freeze came from studies that were done only on young white men. So what do women do? We also do this. We do appease. Because when it gets dangerous for us, it's better that we actually make peace to try to keep ourselves safe than any of these other ones might not work. So it's interesting that to try to get out of your own box is fascinating. So it's interesting also to notice where culture tries to keep you doing something. So what is culture? A definition of culture that I like is how we do things around here. That's a kind of easy definition of culture. And I know something about culture that is forcing you into a framework because I've lived in New Zealand and I know about the tall poppy syndrome, and probably anybody who's in English-speaking countries does. But I also lived in Scandinavia, and Scandinavia has an interesting way of looking at things. So before I go there, I'd forgotten I had this piece here. This diagram asking people which is longer, the longer line A and B, gets a totally different answer from anybody who's grown up in the Western world in the typical box-shaped environment to somebody who's lived outside and is an indigenous person, because an indigenous person can see immediately these two lines are the same length. But for most people who grow up in a room, like you can see this number C, they have a harder time telling which of these lines is longer because they're conditioned to be looking at boxes and squares.